and thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation to come, for the warmth of your welcome, and for the opportunity of us working together and thinking about these challenging issues. And on a day when traditionally we remember those who suffered and died in wars of the past and wars of the present, I think there is no better tribute that we can pay than to try to make sure that there are no more wars. That's what the vast majority of those who've been involved in wars want. They want to make sure no one else has to suffer what they had to suffer. Of course, it's massively challenging. It's not going to be done in a short time, and looking around, not in the lifetime of any of us around here. But that doesn't mean we can't take steps in the right direction. Ending individual wars has always been a preoccupation for those embroiled in them. But as Professor Michael Howard, the Doyen of Military History in Britain, noted, throughout history, the overwhelming majority of human societies have taken war for granted and made it the basis of their legal and social structures. However, addressing the problem of ending wars as a damaging phenomenon of human society has become ever more urgent and challenging in recent years. There was a relatively peaceful period following World War II because the horrors of the 20th century global wars had left politicians and people across the world conscious of and profoundly concerned about the prospect of a third world war, particularly because the Second War had ended with the ushering in of the age of nuclear weapons and the existential threat they represented. However, recently there has been a serious deterioration in global peacefulness, as evidenced by the 2025 Global Peace Index, published by the Institute of Economics and Peace. My friend Steve Killalay and his IEP colleagues have been monitoring and publishing the objective measures of the level of peacefulness around the world for some 2 decades or so now. And in that 19th report published earlier this year, which covers 163 independent states and territories comprising some 99.7% of the world's population, they rated the various levels of peacefulness of these countries. That GPI is now the world's leading measure of global peacefulness, and for the 6th year in a row, that measure has deteriorated. The average country score on the GPI has deteriorated for 13 of the last 17 years and has not improved on average in any year since 2013. This means that the deterioration in global peacefulness is measurable, continuous, and deeply worrying. The existential threat posed by nuclear weapons seemed for a while to have receded because global leaders recognized that if one side were to use nuclear weapons, the other side would respond with the very real danger that a nuclear war would end all human civilization. But as the memory of those 2 devastating global wars faded, and the stable instability of the Cold War gave way to a deterioration in relations between the nuclear powers, there were also major developments in missile technology. An explosive payload, including a nuclear payload, can now be delivered at hypersonic speed, leaving no time for human reflection on the decision of how to respond. Increasingly, there is a pressure to use artificial intelligence in decision-making about how to respond. Indeed, AI has already been used in Israel-Palestine, where thousands of Palestinians have been targeted and killed by the IDF using artificial intelligence programs. At the same time, the worsening environmental crisis is making some parts of the world virtually uninhabitable, resulting in population movements that are triggering political conflict. These developments require us, I believe, to review our understanding of the nature of war and what to do about it. We must find a way to bring wars to an end before wars bring us to an end. The efforts to address the ending of wars, which came to the fore in political and intellectual circles at the end of the First World War, were not the first attempts to address ending wars. Arguably, the Westphalian settlement of 1648 was the most significant earlier attempt to construct a system of agreements that would prevent wars between the major states in Europe. However, the wars did not disappear. And the bloody revolution in France in 1789 led the philosopher Immanuel Kant to pen his essay Towards Perpetual Peace, setting out a democratic peace theory. He believed that however long and difficult the road, if men and women were freed from monarcho-aristocratic regimes, the public debate would result from democratic, republican forms of government would eventually lead to people concluding that they should manage their disagreements in a non-violent way. Kant was not an optimist about human nature, and in that he differed from many of the philosophers of his time who believed that mankind was naturally good but was corrupted by malign leaders. However, Kant saw that war was so horrifying and so costly in both blood and treasure that he believed that in the end, rationality and a moral imperative would ensure the adoption of a more peaceful way of living. The Enlightenment philosophers challenged the old ways of thinking in almost every area of life, including the view that wars were an inevitable element in the human condition. They were convinced that success in the application of rationalism would bring other aspects of human endeavor into order and could apply to war, and that the adoption of rational thought and rational social organization would rid humanity of the pointless and destructive violence of conflict. And it seemed, for a time, that progress was being made along that path until the outbreak of the First World War. The massive slaughter between 1914 and 1918 punctured that liberal optimism. And while many remained hopeful that the end of empires and the expansion of liberal democracy would protect future generations, with research and education holding the key to a more peaceful and prosperous world, not everyone was convinced. The establishment, however, of the League of Nations after the First World War did create a structure through which governments could address their disagreements through rational negotiation. And the American president, Woodrow Wilson, tried mightily to promote the new body. For his efforts, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1919, but he was unable to persuade his own country to join the League of Nations. There were many other efforts to prevent a return to war. One very interesting example, I think, was the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, established in Paris in 1922, bringing together some of the foremost thinkers of the day, including Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Gilbert Murray, and Henry Bergson. In addition to publishing books and papers and organizing courses and university exchanges, the committee engaged in discussions with some of the most eminent intellectuals in the world. One of the best known exchanges is found in the letters between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, published under the title, Why War? Einstein laid out with impressive clarity the challenges he sought, and Freud's response is worth reviewing since, while there have been great changes in the wider context, his summation still sets out the question with great clarity. Freud started by saying, "It is a general principle, then, that conflicts of interest between men are settled by the use of violence, domination by brute violence, or violence supported by the intellect. The rule of law then comes about when several weaker individuals come together to confront a powerful individual. And Freud pointed out that that togetherness must be maintained as a stable community of interests if it is to provide for a culture of lawfulness. For such an agreement can lead to the growth of emotional ties, which strengthen the agreement and provide overall stability." A significant example of this in the history of our own country here was the negotiation between King John and the barons at Runnymede in June 1215, when the king was pressured to sign what became known as Magna Carta, a document that has been the basis for much subsequent Anglo-Saxon law. Freud went on to point out that the key to further development is the extent to which the rule of law in such an agreement applies equally to all. If it does not, this may become the cause of a return to violence, either because the powerful do not want to relinquish their power, or from dissatisfaction of the less powerful who want to be treated equally. This use of violence, or the threat of violence, tends to lead to partial or temporary solutions with a reduction in minor wars, but then the replacement with a few wars on a grand scale, as he described it. Less common, but even more destructive. Freud agreed with Einstein about the principle of setting up a global authority to which all would agree to submit. However, he was doubtful that it could be achieved in practice. It would require much more power than the League of Nations. Indeed, it was Freud's view that it could only be held together either by the force of violence or by strong emotional ties among its members. Unlike the religious nationalist identifications of previous generations, there seemed to be no longer a big idea that exerted a sufficient unifying authority. His views were prescient, given what happened in Europe just shortly afterwards. Freud then set out in the letter, in a simplified form, something of his developing ideas about the life and death instincts, referring to the power and necessary interaction of love and hate. Not of love being simply better than hate, but rather of the importance of a combination of idealistic and destructive impulses. He thought it was not possible to get rid of human aggressive instincts, but we could redeploy or transform them in the evolution of culture and civilization. He spoke of the strengthening of the intellect governing the instincts, internalizing aggression, but he did warn that humanity would not find civilization easy, though, importantly, whatever fosters the growth of civilization, he said, works at the same time against war. He also noted that religion and psychoanalysis used the same word, love, to describe these attachments. And you may be surprised to know that he quoted the commandment from both the Old and New Testaments, not something that you would expect from Freud, perhaps. The quote, of course, was, "Love your neighbor as yourself." At the end of his message, Freud said he felt he'd given a rather disappointing answer to Einstein, for much of what he said had simply repeated Einstein's own observations, and the two factors that he believed might ultimately lead mankind along a more pacifist road were not commonly held by most people. Adopting these two requirements, would require not just the dread of the consequences of a future war, but also a change in the cultural attitude. And as we will see later, while Einstein and perhaps Freud himself may have hoped for an easier solution to the question, these are the same two factors that we must return to consider almost a century later. Taking the second of Freud's two factors, what kind of change in the cultural attitude might be possible to mitigate disaster and potentially the end of humanity? Alfred Lord Tennyson, as you will recall, was Britain's poet laureate during the 19th century imperial reign of Queen Victoria. And though he was called upon, as the poet laureate, to celebrate military events, he wrote much about peace. In December 1899, on the brink of the new century, he published in The Advocate of Peace, a publication of the American Peace Society, a section of his much longer poem, Locksley Hall, 60 years after. I'm very familiar with this piece because it was a favourite poem of my father and often quoted by him. Later in the poem, it says the following. He has a vision of all diseases quenched by science, no man halt or deaf or blind, stronger ever born of weaker, larger body, lustier mind. Earth at last a warless world, a single race, a single tongue. I have seen her far away, for is not earth as yet so young? Every tiger madness muzzled, every serpent passion killed, every grim ravine a garden, every blazing desert tilled. Robed in universal harvest, up to either pole she smiles, universal ocean softly washing all her warless eyes. This vision of global peace was what inspired some of those imperialists who believed their nation to have the best religion, government, and culture, whether British or French or German or others. Later, it was still that kind of vision that inspired those who believed that they had the best political system or philosophy, and that others should grasp the opportunities of liberal democracy or socialism or communism or whatever political program they espoused. However, all of these have proved insufficient to prevent war, and many even became a cause of war. Whatever structural, organizational, and systemic solutions have been espoused, they have all failed to prevent war. And despite the pronouncement by Francis Fukuyama that in the post-war liberal rules-based international order we had finally arrived at just such an evolutionary solution, we now see that too dissolving before our eyes. While some still believe that solutions that failed in the past will be tried again, and others hope that a new perfect system can be contrived to contain the violence of mankind, it seems to me that looking for a single system to solve the problems of war is probably a mistake. Einstein realized, before the Manhattan Project, that's the project that devised the atomic bomb, he realized that science and technology would take humankind along a road to the development of atomic and nuclear weapons so powerful and destructive as to be beyond imagination, perhaps even beyond survival. And he continued to devote himself to thinking and speaking and writing about the dangers for the future of mankind. In an article entitled "The Real Problem is in the Hearts of Men," an article published in the New York Times Magazine in 1946, after the detonation of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein said, "Many persons have inquired concerning a recent message of mine that a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move toward higher levels." He went on, "Past thinking and methods did not prevent world wars. Future thinking must prevent wars." So is there any indication of what such future thinking might involve? After the invention of the atomic bomb and the development of the hydrogen bomb later, something that Oppenheimer, who had directed the Manhattan Project, was completely opposed to, scientists at Los Alamos continued their more general research and began to realize that there were limitations to their understanding of mathematics and physics. They realized that in breaking everything down into fundamental components, they had lost a sense of structure, data, and organization. These observations set the scene for the elaboration of systems theory, and later, and more recently, of complexity thinking. And social scientists and psychologists also began to appreciate that addressing individuals and their function and dysfunctioning failed to explain many of the communal problems that they were trying to understand. They could not bring about a therapeutic betterment without addressing the context and relationships of individuals, families, and societies. This approach came to be known as complexity thinking, and I think it may turn out to be part of the future thinking to which Einstein was referring. Scientific analysis until then had involved breaking everything down into its most fundamental elements, but also splitting knowledge and scientific ideas and into specialized silos, so that we would all have separate elements within university life, for example. Now, while experimentation in ever more specialized areas of knowledge has been incredibly successful as a scientific method and as an approach to technological development, we may, as Einstein suggested, have come to the point where it no longer answers some of the most important questions we need to ask, and so a new approach is needed. Complex systems exist at every level of organization, but instead of seeing the commonalities, we've tended to focus on the differences between subjects, levels, and disciplines. In working with human beings, for example, we consider the psychology that explores individual functioning as quite separate from politics. But politics is really the psychology of large groups and how we function as communities of people. Religion is regarded as completely separate from more scientific enterprises in human knowledge. However, if we set aside the different authority structures and doctrinal and belief statements and liturgical forms of worship and so on in the different religions, we find that fundamentally they are all about the way that individuals and communities engage with the complexity of our wider universe relationships. In other words, if psychology is the study of how we manage our contrary internal wishes and impulses, often loving and hating the same person at the same time, and that person may be ourselves, and politics is how communities manage the contrary wishes and impulses of our communities, both within large groups and between them, then religion is the way we manage our relations with the wider universe and obligations in the face of a degree of complexity and contradiction and mystery that's beyond our understanding as human beings. The idea that we, with our small brains, could encompass the whole of the universe and understand it is perhaps a little bit of a high expectation. And given the difficulty and complexity of ending wars, we require every possible understanding and holding together of both the simplicity and the complexity of that task. The simplicity of war might be stated as follows. Wars arise because there are human beings. Without human beings, there would be no human conflict. But human beings have differing wishes, interests, and desires even within themselves, but certainly between themselves and others. When some human beings decide to impose their will on others, and those others resist, there's a conflict. If both groups are prepared to use physical force to force their will or to resist, then there's a fight, which may escalate and cause enough casualties to qualify for a description as a war. The complexity of war arises when we ask the questions, why do human beings wish to impose their will on others? And why do they persist in this when it creates risks of harm to themselves and their own community too? There's been a general view that the causes are greed, ambition, inequality, and the rivalry of powerful people. And that's why it was believed that moving away from governance by authoritarian leaders and constructing post-imperial liberal democracies would resolve the problem. But neither the end of empires and the growth of liberal democracy, nor the creation of the League of Nations and later the United Nations, has resolved the problem, and we're facing the most dangerous period in the entire existence of humanity. My own experience in addressing conflict, at first in Ireland and then in various parts of the world, was that there were three elements that were always present in situations of intractable political violence. The first was the existence of one or more communities that felt humiliated and disrespected. The second was the perception by such communities that they were treated deeply unfairly, and this was not just a question of economic inequality. And thirdly, peaceful democratic processes had failed to resolve the sense of disrespect and unfairness. Only finding ways of addressing these three issues could remove the danger of political violence and war. So in my own situation, it was a question of dealing with disrespect by treating everyone in a respectful way, whether or not you agreed with them. When it was a question of unfairness, it was a matter of demonstrating fairness to all elements in the community. And thirdly, opening the doors so that those that had dismissed democracy in favor of violence and terrorism could come through the doors of political democracy and involve themselves in the democratic process. It's also clear from research studies with a number of my colleagues that the will to fight in frontline combatants is not associated, contrary to what some people think, with a desire for material benefit. It's often said that various groups of people do things because of what they get out of it. But the sacrifice of material concerns is much more characteristic of people that involve themselves in these things. I remember I served in Belfast City Council with a Sinn Féin councillor who had been one of the people on the hunger strike. And in fact, he didn't live for very long because he'd been so badly damaged. But I remember him telling me about when he was in prison and the prison officers, when they were involved in the dirty protest and starving themselves and so on. So, behave yourself or it'll be the worse for you. And he said, and we said to them, what exactly is it that you're going to do to me that's worse than what I'm doing to myself? Because what they were prepared to do was to destroy themselves for the sake of what they regarded as a higher cause. So this is if you like, a sacred value. I don't by that mean a religious value. The life of my child, the survival of my community. These are sacred values. They're values that cannot be understood in mere socioeconomic and material terms. They're not necessarily religious values, sometimes they are, but they transcend normal measures. They can't be measured by a cost-benefit analysis using socioeconomic metrics. The dangers of war, then, are increased when individuals and groups apply their intelligence and ingenuity and creativity not just to addressing these principles that I've described, but also to the development of tools and instruments of war to better enable them to express their anger and aggression and impose their will on others, and if necessary, eliminate them. Until 1945, the limits of our capacity as human beings to destroy our enemies and wreak havoc ensured that no matter how violent a conflict was, the world could repair itself. Since that time, there is no such reassurance. In addition, outside the context of conflict and without the intention of harm, human activity has increasingly impacted the systems of the natural world and damaged its capacity to repair itself. We are therefore faced with the prospect of both nuclear holocaust and environmental catastrophe. The first of these existential threats conforms to what Freud referred to as the consequences of a future war. The latter is an additional threat of which there was relatively little awareness in his times, and arguably not such a degree of peril until the post-war period. Now, despite the danger and clear scientific and experiential evidence, there are only modest indications of humanity really taking either seriously. In addition to these two existential threats, the science that brought us the benefits and threats from nuclear power has now brought us other technological developments, in particular what we call artificial intelligence. And like nuclear power, AI brings huge potential benefits, but also substantial dangers, including environmental challenges because of the huge amounts of energy such systems consume, but also because they could well lead to humanity losing control of our world to machines. Let me return to the diminishing peacefulness set out in the IEP reports I mentioned at the start. For in an accelerating trend over recent years, months, even days, there have been shifts in government policies, resources, and public debate away from global peace, peace building and development, and towards national security and defense. This transition is driven by long-term changes in the global political economy, especially the rise of China, the defection of Russia, Israel, and the United States from a rules-based world order, as well as the effects of climate change and new technologies to which I've just referred. These trends have been stimulated by frustration with the slow progress in fulfilling the expectations of a global society characterized by liberty, equality, and fraternity, and have been accelerated most recently by the significant disruption to long-standing US and international norms and institutions since the January 2025 inauguration of President Donald Trump for his second mandate. The behavior of Russia, Israel, and the United States has irreparably displaced core elements of the post-World War II rules-based international order, such as the inviolability of national sovereignty, and it has promoted the pursuit of national interests through the law of force rather than the force of law, with a disregard for the accepted norms of what is permissible in the conduct of war and abandoning those responsibilities required of occupying powers. As a result, for the foreseeable future, I'm afraid, colleagues, we will have to cope with a global system where at least 2 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as several other regional powers and states, are choosing to operate outside the parameters of the post-war international order. Many of the states from around the world, including the remaining permanent members of the UN Security Council, are still trying to uphold what is left of the multilateral system. However, some, especially in the industrialized West, are at the same time shifting significant resources and attention to strengthening their national defense and security capabilities in the hope of deterring potential aggression from these defector states. And this is very understandable. But there is now less policy space for peace work than at any point since the end of World War II. Instead, the focus seems to be on maintaining national and international security through investments in military and related defense capabilities. Policy interest and budget allocations for peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace-building institutions, program and research funding has all been in sharp decline as resources have shifted to countering hybrid threats to national security and the strengthening of military alliances. A young military officer in Europe today is far more likely to be training or advising Ukrainian forces in the conduct of a full-scale war with Russia, or engaging in NATO or European exercises to defend their country from a Russian attack, rather than being deployed as a UN peacekeeper. By the end of World War II, throughout the period of the Cold War, and in the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, maintaining international peace and security and preventing another world war was the central focus of international diplomacy and the global multilateral system. The UN 1992 Agenda for Peace introduced the operational concepts of peacemaking and preventive diplomacy, as well as peace building and peacekeeping. Many state and civil institutions were dedicated to promoting peace, developing mediation, peacekeeping, and peace-building capabilities, and investing in knowledge about how to achieve and sustain peace. This peace ecosystem developed as a collective response to the two terrible global conflicts of the 20th century, with the primary aim of preventing another war on that scale, especially since, as I've said earlier, we had the potential for mutually assured nuclear destruction. Hitler had been defeated by a conventional war, somewhat similar in its modality, if not in its technology, to the defeat of Napoleon 130 years before. But the use and availability of nuclear weapons and now AI have radically changed the likely end and outcome of any global conflict in the future. Such wars could, I think, end in at least three ways. Either there could be a negotiated outcome, maybe after there was a ceasefire, or there could be a collapse of one side or the other through internal disintegration, or there could be a global nuclear catastrophe. The stated purpose of having nuclear weapons was the deterrence of any attempt to defeat the regime that possessed them. However, if they believed they faced an existential threat from outside, they were likely to press the nuclear button with catastrophic consequences. The theory behind the rules-based international order was that if all states signed up to the rules and could engage as members of the United Nations, a large-scale war could be prevented by the universal acceptance of the rules and the availability of recognized processes of negotiation. And for 7 decades after the Second World War, confidence grew that while there were still regional wars, the adherence to agreed international rules meant that these smaller wars could largely be managed so that none would scale up to be a threat to global peace and security. But as the memory of the two world wars of the 20th century faded, the attention and resources of states shifted. It moved from maintaining the post-war peace through the period of the Cold War to then conducting a global war in terror. And then the priority moved to preventing and countering violent extremism, and subsequently what was called stabilization. But the more recent wars in Ukraine and Gaza represent a tipping point, where the focus on national and regional ambitions by some powerful states has displaced the commitment to maintain international peace and global security. What is left of the peace ecosystem will have to adapt to significant cuts in the funding of political and economic development assistance and peace building, with a pivot in government attention and public debate to defense and related national security capabilities. Over the post-war decades, there has been an increase in knowledge about factors that influence systemic resilience and societal stability. There was substantial development of capacities in conflict analysis, mediation, and institution building, and the UN showed that it could deploy ceasefire verification and other peace operations. Insofar as this peace ecosystem remains, and some of it does, it is of great value as we navigate the uncertainties and challenges of the transition to some kind of new international arrangement. In addition, some of those capabilities and lessons that may appear less relevant just now in the context of interstate war and the focus on national interest may be needed again downstream. And if this knowledge and capability are lost, our national, regional, and international security and defense systems will be less resilient. It is very important to hold on to as much as possible of what we have learned and built. Now, not all resilience is good, nor is all disruption negative. Many national, regional, and international peace and development institutions have become inefficient, and vested interests have made them resistant to change. Resilience can be understood as the capacity of a system to maintain or return to its previous stability in the face of a disruptive impact. Where the steady state is an undesirable one, and there are many undesirable steady states around in our world, its resilience makes it difficult to effect lasting change for the better, because it is resilient. Contrariwise, new technologies that alter the type and balance of military hardware and the conduct of war, even though they can produce terrible destruction, can make systemic shifts more possible. New systems have often been simply an addition to the armamentarium rather than a replacement of old weapons. When you look at the war in Ukraine, it's not that the old ways of doing war have disappeared. You've still got tanks and trenches. But there are new ways. In fact, we've even invented a new space in which to do war. In the past, there was land and sea and air and space, and now we've created cyberspace where we can do war in a new place that we've actually created. So, if we direct ourselves thoughtfully, wisely, and creatively, resource and other pressures, including technological advances, could create problems, but they could also create opportunities and a stimulus for those who conduct wars, but also encourage those committed to peace building and development, enabling us to try to find ways to be more lean, agile, flexible, and creative as we're forced to adapt to the needs and realities of the 21st century. Countries like Japan that frequently experience natural disasters, and the people and institutions of the global south who have been on the periphery of the rules-based international order may have very valuable experiences that can guide us and other more developed industrialized societies in how to manage in times of uncertainty and insecurity. We may learn from them how to navigate a way to a new positive resilience that accepts systemic change while maintaining and even bettering the well-being of our people. This is all important because, as Einstein said, the challenges we face will not be resolved by just adapting or updating our techniques and technologies. If past thinking and methods did not prevent world wars, he said, future thinking must prevent wars. I've already spoken about the development of an understanding of complex systems. And when it became apparent that lower level systems could be impacted by higher levels of functioning, a simple hierarchical structure of systems was no longer convincing. And so a new way of thinking about science began to develop, so-called complexity thinking. This complexity thinking focuses less on structures than on relationships. What do I mean? Well, take physics, for example. The new thinking concentrates much less on particles and how to measure them, because it became clear that actually you could either measure the size and mass, or you could measure the speed of change, but you couldn't measure both at the same time because they had different significances. So what was important to do was to try to understand the relationship between the various force fields rather than the things themselves. Well, that complexity of thinking in physics, of course, is also important when we think about relationships of human beings. Everything in the universe is about relationships, relationships between entities of various kinds and at various levels, including ourselves. So complexity, with its focus on relationships, may, it seems to me, be the new type of thinking that Einstein had called for, and may be particularly relevant for navigating the current period of transition in the global order. While World War II ended with the victory of the most militarily and technologically advanced alliance in the history of the world, the development and use of nuclear weapons has, rather paradoxically, brought to an end the possibility of the victory of the most powerful. For since the end of the Second World War, the United States has found it increasingly difficult to win wars, no matter how powerful the weaponry it develops. The Korean War ended in a draw. The Vietnam War was a humiliating defeat, as were the wars in Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. In Iraq and elsewhere, the more technologically and militarily powerful states have been able to inflict terrible, terrible destruction. And of course, we've seen that again recently in Gaza. But the result is not a victory for liberal democracy. The result is simply a destroyed and chaotic failed state. Top-down efforts at control are not enough to achieve predictable outcomes, and less powerful groups can actually bring about the defeat of much more powerful opponents. This is contrary to what our expectations have been through history. One example of a very powerful state, of course, being brought to the negotiating table by a terrorist organisation can be seen in the Northern Ireland peace process that ended centuries of violent political conflict on the island of Ireland and between Britain and Ireland. After decades of failed attempts at bringing peace through the implementation of liberal democratic values and political structures, a lasting peace settlement was achieved through an approach based on addressing relationships. Three key disturbed historic sets of communal relationships between pro-British Protestant Unionists and pro-Irish Catholic nationalists in the north of the island, between the people of the north and the people of the south in Ireland, and between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Complexity thinking is characterized by a focus on understanding relationships, whether personal or social, or as I said, even at a fundamental level in physics. And it became clear to us that if we address those relationships, then the kind of structures that would develop would come out of that. They would emerge from that, rather than creating and imagining structures and hoping that people would fit in with them. The last thing you need to do with Irish people is create something and get them to try to fit in with it. It just don't work. But if you focus on relationships and people get the sense that they are being treated fairly and with respect, then all sorts of things that were otherwise not possible become possible. That whole question of relationships, and indeed relationships between the state and the population, we see it on this side of the water, for example, in changes in relationships between the police and the community. And it's crucial that those relationships can be rebuilt for everyone's sake. A theory of change, then, informed by relationships and complexity thinking, will also understand the significance of time. Unsatisfactory situations, I'm afraid, can survive for much longer than we might expect or hope from a rational examination of the pressures for change. But when the change comes, it can be much faster and more dramatic than we imagine. Dams do not burst gradually. The pressure may build up gradually and may not be noticed, but when the dam bursts, it does so suddenly, and political change is often the same, long delayed and then unexpectedly dramatic. Other key insights from complexity thinking include the appreciation that social and other complex systems make sense of and cope with uncertainty by continuous adaptation to the environment. They do not do it by working everything out in a plan in advance and then implementing the plan. They do it by learning from doing, a process that consists of iterative cycles of strategic probing, evidence-based reflection, purposeful selection and rejection based on the emerging results of each cycle of the ongoing evolutionary process. Now, those working on sustaining peace, maintaining security and preventing future wars, including through deterrence, need to employ similar adaptive approaches to make sense of, cope with, and proactively navigate the uncertainties of the global transition. In other words, it's a serious mistake to think that it's possible to make out a plan that can simply be followed through in an orderly way. You know from your own relationships that there are sometimes things that you can do that are helpful, and then doing exactly the same thing at another time or context is extremely unhelpful. That's the way relationships are. They have a context, and it's a context that's fluid and always changing. So those of us working for peaceful relations may have to be prepared to try various options devised to suit the particular conflicted relationships of the context at that time. We have to be prepared for a series of trials and iterations to learn from the efforts that did not bring success as well as those that did. Now, in practice, it can be very difficult to persuade funders to support an approach like this because they want the plan that's supposed to be fully worked out in advance and costed and monitored to ensure the approved scheme is being followed, even if there's no evidence at all that it's being successful. But you signed up to do this, so you have to continue on doing it. However rational and apparently reasonable such an approach may seem to civil servants and funders, the evidence is that in human affairs, especially complex and conflictual relations, such an approach just simply doesn't work. I'll give you an example from Northern Ireland. Everybody, when I went into political life, agreed that it was hopeless to engage with the people who were involved in violence. They weren't interested in negotiation at all. So the sensible thing to do is get reasonable people on the unionist side, reasonable people on the nationalist side, reasonable people in the centre, come get together, reach an agreement, and that would marginalise extremism. Entirely rational. The only problem about it was it didn't work. It didn't work repeatedly. And that only made everybody angry and depressed. So we have to be prepared to think in a much more complex and relationship-involved way. Another insight from complexity thinking is that network systems that benefit from the distributed knowledge, burden sharing, and resilience of a larger system and group are much more robust in managing shocks and setbacks, investing in mechanisms that facilitate and sustain cooperative relationships among those with shared interests without limiting the adaptive capacities of any parts of it. They seem much more likely to manage in this turbulent phase of world history. And this is exactly the opposite of the approach being taken by President Donald Trump. He has decided the solution to America's problems is in imposing tariffs on other countries and focusing exclusively on American interests. This engagement is transactional, not relational. Insofar as there is a relational element to his analysis, it might seem to be what one might characterize as Yalta 2.0. You will remember that in February 1945, at a meeting in Yalta, F.D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the leaders of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, decided amongst themselves how the spheres of influence in the post-war world would be divided up. And it would seem that President Trump believes that he and President Putin and President Xi can similarly determine how the new post-liberal dispensation can be managed. But it won't work. The Yalta Agreement took place in the aftermath of World War II, and everybody was quite clear about the outcome of the war and who the victors were. There was no argument about that. When the United Nations was created later in 1945, it opened up seats, permanent seats for the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, those on the winning side, and that recognized the political reality. But in 2025, there are wars all over the place and no agreement about outcome. In addition, the political reality has changed. There are increasingly powerful states like India, Brazil, South Africa, and they're not going to accept decisions being made over their head by somebody else. And that's not to mention the states of the European Union who totally reject the new order that Presidents Trump and Putin might wish to see and are still thinking about how they might relate with China. In other words, it's a much more complex world, and governing will require an understanding of how to engage in constructive relationships and influence and manage complex systems, not simply engage in transactions for your own interest. Just as the system of global governance will need to take account of these changes, so too those of us involved in the peace ecosystem need to see our ideas undergo significant transformation if we are to be relevant to the new realities of peace and security in the 21st century. Much of the knowledge and many of the practices and institutions that were developed in the aftermath of the two world wars remain relevant and valuable. But they may need to be adapted and woven into the new realities and emerging needs of the 21st century, including the technological ones and the threats to which I have made reference. This is a century characterized thus far by a return to great power rivalry and authoritarian governments, rather than more respectful intergovernmental relations between an increasing number of liberal democratic states. For the last 15 or 16 years, every year has seen a reduction in the number of states that could be described as liberal democracies. We have got to face that very painful reality. And one implication of the dissolution of the liberal democratic order and return to forms of authoritarian governance, albeit with many more players than was the case at the start of the 20th century, is that peace practice and research needs to rethink its models and understandings. We need, as peacemakers, to become more adaptive, more pragmatically orientated towards resilience, and with the preparedness to respond to future shocks and setbacks. If there is one key characteristic of the approach to peace building in this new age of disorder, it is that we should focus less on structures, constitutions, regulations, organizations, and more on the disturbed historic relationships between communities that is at the heart and root of violence and war. I'm convinced that the ending of individual wars, and insofar as is possible, the ending of war as a method of dealing with profound rivalries and deep disagreement, will not be achieved by identifying a religion or a nation or a national or other political philosophy or a system. If war represents a disturbance in historic relations between communities, then what would repair that breakdown? Not focusing on a single solution, but recognizing that we all have different visions and values that will inevitably conflict. Just as we have wishes within ourselves that often conflict and clash with each other, and that we have to find a way of accommodating. Isaiah Berlin recognized not only that all cultures were not ultimately commensurable, that there were not objective ahistorical answers to the perennial questions facing us, but rather that we have values that conflict and compete with each other. And this realization led him to develop the idea of value pluralism. It's not the case that all values are of the same order, nor is there a simple hierarchy. Rather, we must hold to our different perspectives and experiences, even though they may be in disagreement with others, but we need to do it without violence. It's an example of the challenge of the difficulty of relationships. People often say to me, John, it's wonderful that in 1998, in the Good Friday Agreement, you reached an agreement. I said, well, yes, but you need to understand, the basic agreement was how to disagree without killing each other. At an individual human level, we all know relationships are never sorted. If you've got a relationship and you think it's sorted, it's already in trouble because you think it's sorted. Because you've got to work all the time with these things. You've got to nourish them. It doesn't mean that we can't have a relationship that's stable, dependable, and supportive and trustworthy, and we must work to that at a personal level, at an intergovernmental level. But these qualities cannot be taken for granted without a constant nourishing of the relationships. Such a recognition begins to change our perspectives about ending war. It implies that there is no specific formula for ending individual wars or wars as a way of dealing with our differences. There's no structure or process that inevitably brings peace, stability, and reconciliation between enemies. So, for example, instead of being comfortable to keep repeating the French revolutionary cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity, we may have to substitute it with a much less simplistic freedom, fairness, and community. Freedom is more complex than the notions there were of liberty. And equality, how can we obtain, how can we achieve equality? We're all different. And if we have different wishes and different capacities and different achievements and different relationships, there can't be equality in a meaningful sense. But that's not to say that the current obscene degree of inequality is not wholly unacceptable and destabilizing. But it is to say that sameness, if it is then an inevitable requirement, is not achievable. It's about relationships that recognize difference. And fraternity, apart from the gender element of it, suggests a positive relationship with those with whom we already identify. That's not the problem. The problem is, how do we engage when we live in a community that's not homogeneous? How do we develop a working relationship with those around us who are not our friends, who don't have the same views and visions? That's the challenge. We need to work for viable community relationships with those who are very different from us and do not share our ideas about the good. One of the great challenges is there is not agreement about the good, and we still have to find ways of working with each other. It's not that we should abandon the search for agreement. It's essential that we continue to develop workable structures and negotiating processes that allow enemies to find a way to the table and away from the battlefield. My close friend and colleague from Mumbai, Sundeep Waslekar, has recently described in some detail an updated version of structures of this kind in his book, A World Without War, well worth reading and being very widely read in a number of different languages now. However, it seems to me, and I know from conversations with him, that following the creation of structures and processes will not of itself bring a result without the development of positive working relationships between the participants. The best result that can be hoped for is not agreement all round, but a sufficient agreement to allow political institutions to function, but a sufficient disagreement that will realistically reflect the genuine cultural differences that exist. I remember when I was acting as Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, it was very important that although we did not want it breaking down into violence, that I facilitated people disagreeing with each other in debate and expressing that. Because if they didn't express it, it wouldn't be honest, and they wouldn't be able to persuade their own supporters outside that they were doing something to represent their views when there was genuine difference. The aim of conflict resolution is not there for the reaching of agreement and satisfaction about all the social, political, economic, and legal options. It is rather about getting ourselves to a place as communities where those who differ deeply can accept that disagreement without harming each other. If any particular war, or war more generally, as a means of resolving differences can be let go in that way, then there can be some hope that a sufficient set of relationships can be established and then subsequently nourished so that parties concerned can abandon war as the only way of addressing their deepest differences. And we all need to work and pray that we can bring that about. Thank you very much.